When Laura asked me to talk, we had to negotiate exactly what I was going to talk about. So I am so involved in thinking about what's happening in the United States and the election that I would have come here and talked about the Trump phenomenon, but she told me I couldn't do that. So instead, I tried finessing some of what's happening in the United States with the notion of what's happening outside in the world, including the developing world that we'll be visiting. And this is pretty much what you're going to hear. I also, whenever I talk, I never talk without PowerPoint. I'm like addicted to having things on words and having graphs, you'll see, and I talk really, really fast. But normally when people are with me, you have my slides on on some device, or you have them on paper, so it makes it a little easier. But if I go too fast, just stop me, because I am like a train. Once I start, I'm like, I've left the station, and you got to stop me. Okay, so I'm discussing. I decided to call this globalization's discontents, and here's the real story. This is what I'm going to tell you. I think that the building blocks of today's world economy are being uprooted, and they're being uprooted by political forces, and the political forces are forces of nationalism. We've never seen it before, and I'm going to argue to you that this is fundamentally going to alter the trajectory of the countries we're going to see. And that trajectory is toward democratic governance and toward economic development. And I'm just going to connect things happening here with why it's going to affect those countries there. Okay, so let me start with what were the building blocks? What was the world before we had this nationalism, what I would say is this shock of nationalism? So I'd say for the past 50 years, certainly since World War II, the world really has focused on integration, which is to say in both the developed and developing world, all of the barriers to trade and investment have been coming down. This integration project is not just something of the left or something on the right, but it really was a shared enterprise in the developed world. Each side might have had different policies. So really the left, which is what's called the liberals, the Labour Party in Britain, the Democratic Party here, really loved open borders because they thought it was a cure to world inequality. The right, on the other hand, had a different story. It was an opportunity for economic specialization and to make money. But both thought basically that it was good for collective humanity, and they shared this premise. The way it was going to happen, this integration, really was through trade. It was the opening of borders to goods and services, and it was the backbone of what liberal politics has looked like. This is not liberal left. This is liberal economic politics in the post-World War II period. This whole notion of what trade does and the left and the right is totally been flipped over. Trade is, instead of being thought of as positive, it is now seen as a malevolent force. And this is not just on the left or not just on the right. It is on both sides are worrying about what trade does. Now, why did it happen? And what does it mean for the less world traveled? And what does it mean for the US? I'm going to sort of go through this pretty fast. Okay. I'm going to tell you that the problem is not an absence of wealth in the developed world, but it's a distribution problem. We're dealing with something we haven't seen before, which is an unequal distribution of wealth and an inability to come up the economic hierarchy. And it's causing this huge backlash, and the huge backlash is manifest as nationalism. Okay, how do I know that it's not the absence of wealth? I want to tell you it's not that we're poor. Okay, here's what I know. I have to tell you the vast majority of the world's population today has really been on an upward trajectory. Living standards since World War II have just been way better than ever before in humankind's history. Even in the places we're going, the least traveled places, people have access to new and productively enhancing technologies. You know, there is people all over the world who have access to goods they never had before. Innovation from the developed world has brought a much higher standard of living to the poor. You know, technology here is something that's good for society. And just basically, fewer people are being born. You know, 30 years ago, we were worrying about a population explosion. That's not happening now. All these things are really very, very good. And you can look at this in terms of the numbers. The average per capita GDP, that's the wealth, for the world in 1980 was 80% better than it was in 1950. It had really grown. And then if you look at it from between 1980 and 2010, it was another 80% better. People are getting richer. They're getting better. They have more things than they ever had before. The average material well-being for the world is really about 3 times what it was in 1950. Okay, so the world is on this upward spiral. It's not what you might think of if you listen to some political leaders. And really more what I'm going to tell you is the US has really benefited from this integration. You know, for us, most basically products are cheaper. You know, I just, pull out some examples. You know, the relative price of baby and toddler clothing in the US, I did this for Laura, dropped 10% since 1999. People who have to buy toddler clothes. And the most amazing, there's no inflation from consumer goods. Prices have been declining pretty much on a straight path since 1950. But you want to ask, is it bad for wages? Is the problem integration bad for wages? You know, I have to say, really not. Wages are higher in jobs that have something to do with exports. And I'll show you some data on this. This is just one way of thinking about comparing average wages, average monthly wages. What you see is really anyone in the export-intensive sector is doing better than those that have to rely on the US market alone. Any way you look at it, managers and professionals, service industry, if you are relying on domestic-only production, you're not going to be making as much money. And so the notion that integration has been bad for America is really not economically supported, at least not easily. So you might ask, why is everyone upset? You know, vote yes, keep Made in America. You know, why is that? Okay, I'll tell you why. The problem is that open trade substitutes US labor for that in the developing world. It's a simple thing. The easiest way to think about it is it's like having huge numbers of immigrants from China arrive in the US to work in factories, except they stay in China. That is what's happening. Wages equalize because the market is open. Wages go down. And then what happens? Voters rebel. And all of a sudden, the US has a majority in favor of economic isolation. It is like the manifest market-driven dislocation that is good for most people, but not for everybody. So job uncertainty breeds this pro-isolation narrative, and the narrative is really appealing, but it is really misleading. So what is the narrative? The narrative, which you hear on TV all the time, the rich elites are ripping you off, immigrants want your job, free trade is killing our nation's competitiveness, and then the answer, people who are pushing this line, is redistribution, down from the elites down, protectionism, close your markets, anti-NAFTA, and restrictionism, restrict immigrants. I want to tell you this is all off the mark, at least historically, politically, economically. First, I want to tell you, I think it's off the mark because it pits our development, American development, against other nations' development. Poverty alleviation is good for the United States. It's really good foreign policy. It's good economic policy. Empowering poor nations is, in fact, the easiest path to political liberty and democracy. But on this trip, I'm going to talk a lot about good governance. Second, it really, and I did it a million times, misconstrues the sources of US economic inequality in handing it to trade, when in reality, the bugaboo is technology and is poor public policy. The real culprit is a lack of economic growth. So what is really going on? Here's the bad news. Since around the turn of the century, the US has lost about 5.6 million manufacturing jobs. Okay, any which way you cut it, about 13%, that's it, 13% of these are due to trade. The rest of them, about 97%, is due to automation. The real problem is automation, it's not trade. Anti-trade folks say that trade has killed the steel industry. You hear this all the time because of the Midwest. You need to, the problem with the argument is today we make as much steel as we did 20 years ago. Just we do it with fewer people. American factories produced more goods last year than ever before, but they did so with less workers, about 12.3 million less workers. Both Democrats and Republicans, both sides, the left and the right, think tariffs would be good public policy. It's a Baptist bootlegger coalition. But the problem is that we can put tariffs on those products, but what's going to happen is the jobs are going to go to robots. They're not going to go to workers. And that's just what's going to happen. We have a problem. There's no question we have a problem, but it's not that we have low tariffs. The real problem is something that we're in a liquidity trap, which you don't have to talk too much about it, but it's a result of demography, a low savings rate. What we have is insufficient demand for our goods and services. And it causes price stagnation. Prices fall even when we have zero interest rates. The economy is having problems. It's not due to trade. So the question is there a virtuous circle where we could protect U.S. jobs, we could protect economic development for the rest of the world? Is there a way to do it? Well, I'm going to say you can, but it's not easy. Here, for example, is a factory. I've been on trips, and we can see factories all over the world. These are just providing jobs for Ford. It's a Ford factory, and they're creating parts of the seats of the car. All those women are making a lot more money, and they're not immigrating to the United States, just as an aside. The industry that moves things around the globe is one of the most efficient, technologically rich, and humanity appealing or proving part of who we are. But we have this problem, and now I'm going to show you some data. So, okay, the problem is manufacturing employment is dwindling. Okay, and that's what this line is. This is manufacturing, and this is manufacturing, this is services. It's not like we don't have jobs. It's just that we don't have jobs in manufacturing. It's flat. There are just no jobs in it. In the manufacturing jobs should always be juxtaposed around where we do have. It's not like there are no jobs. There are lots of jobs. There's jobs in education and leisure and professional business and a variety of things, less in mining. There is just no jobs in here. The problem, the flip side of what's going on, the benefits of going on is back to what I said about the cheap clothes. This is an inflation index. And this is prices in 1980 of products. And all of these products are just as cheap today as they were in 1980. That's an awesome thing. We've had so much inflation since 1980. Yet all these problems, toys, furniture, apparel, new cars, food at home, all these things had not increased in price at all. And they haven't increased in price at all because of world markets, because of this problem of lowering wages. There are things that have gotten more expensive. This is the biggest, college tuition.
Which one is that?
College tuition. Way up, way up. And the other really one that's above inflation has really been medical care. Different lecture, but that's what's happening. You might ask, okay, I just said to you, cheap, everything's cheaper. It's great. But then you should say logically, well, who's going to buy this stuff if they don't have jobs because we've exported their jobs? The problem is that the inability to make a weekly income that allows you to benefit from the cheap products is entirely oriented or entirely explained by education. So what this is it just shows you for 4 groups of folks, less than high school, some college, and a bachelor's degree, the vast difference in how they have done in terms of income over this period. This is the same period I've been showing you from 1980 on. College people have done very well. And they have done even better because they can buy cheap stuff at Walmart. But as you move down here, these folks have done increasingly less good. The less educated in this world economy where we can just hire Chinese workers to do it are going to suffer and have suffered. Okay, so what do? The problem is goods are cheaper, wealth is stagnant, and there's no social mobility. So what does a country do with it? Let me go back. This is sort of, inequality is really the buzzword of this decade. And there's been just tons of books written about it. It really is the issue that our political leaders are dealing with at the moment. And the problem is that inequality is really hard to deal with. It's really a sticky problem. So how do we measure inequality? Normally what we do is we look at how where the parents were in terms of the income distribution, and then we look to see how the kids do. And as it turns out, fewer than 10% of those born into the bottom fifth of the income distribution, imagine all the distribution in fifths, fewer than 10% of them make it to the top fifth. And that's been over the last 50 years in the United States. People are not moving up. And it's really no better if you start in the middle. We used to talk about the middle class that can rise to the top. But the data suggests that it's really very hard to do that. Only about 20% of the children in the middle class will rise to the top fifth. There is a lot less income mobility than people have thought was necessary in order to keep support, let's say, for, let's say, this integration project. And the only route really today to make it up is through education. And it's not surprising, we're seeing an education institution. It is the only one. This you can just see a here's wealth. We're still in the 80s. This is, if you're in the top 90th percentile, look what's happened to you in this period of time. You've done really well. And here's the median. The average is really, they've done terribly. And this is a political problem for democracy. So all those people vote. All those people vote. So is Brexit or anti-NAFTA and anti-WTO the answer? It's certainly the answer we're being told. You know, I have to tell you, it's just, if I had more time, I'd go into it. It's absolutely not. This is just a way of thinking about what's going to happen if the U.S. decides to, say, close its markets on the NAFTA side. This is just the percentage of private sector jobs that are going to be lost in the U.S. if you really close our markets to trade. You know, these are huge in the dark ones. Greater than 5% of the jobs in the state of California are going to be lost if, in fact, we close our markets. The entire country is pink. Everyone will suffer. And there's just no other way to think about it. You close the market, robots get the jobs, there's some redistribution internally, but basically we get job losses. It is a terrible answer. So back to the world less travel. So what I want to say is these kinds of, the way in which we're thinking about development in the first world, the United States, Britain, Germany, really has huge effects on the countries that we're going to visit in this itinerary. You know, if you look broadly, and we look at the countries we're going to visit, one thing I think you'd find is that there really are virtues to engagement in the world. And the virtues are all over. There's investment in factories, there's investment in goods, there's the ability to have technology. You see all these things as we're traveling. U.S. engagement in the world is good. Second thing I think we're going to see from this particular trip is that there are limits to globalization. And those limits need to be finessed, and they need to be finessed by U.S. policy. Bad U.S. policy leads to really even worse externalities on the part of the developing world. The third thing I'd say you're going to see as we go through the world, the diversity of experiences in the developed world. There isn't one road. You know, people address problems differently. And it's not necessarily like there's one right word and one wrong way to do this, but the differences are really quite stark. But I'd say the most important thing, what I'm going to say again, you decide to come on this trip, it is so much involved in good governance. You want to have a good life, you have to figure a way to organize your society in order to have the collective goods provision done in a way that is fair, that is equitable, and that brings economic wealth. The bottom line is about governance. It's about governance, and that is really hard. Democracy is really, really hard. And I think that's my last chart. There we go. Did I do it in a half hour? Yes.
Good evening. About a year ago, I was trying to do one of these TED Talks, Stanford TED Talks. And they told me that people usually use one of these. And it's good that you should try this with your class. So I tried in my class to do a rehearsal for my TED Talk. Students said, you can't do two things at the same time. Forget about the clicker. So I'm not going to have a clicker. I'm going to just talk. It is, for me, this trip is, for several reasons, a remarkable trip and a privilege to go on. One of them is that I will be traveling with Judith Goldstein. I came to Stanford 15 years ago, 10 years ago. I was appointed director of the Iranian Studies, and she was my boss. She was the person who made the appointment. So for me to travel with her is really a remarkable privilege and pleasure. But having said that, I have a slightly different take than of globalization. And in a sense, our two narratives, I think, fit rather interestingly. I'm going to talk about cultural aspects. And I'm going to basically say that something has broken in the world, something that there was some consensus on for almost 500 years. That consensus was on modernity. Not modernization, but modernity. Modernity meant a paradigm shift, some say bigger than any ever in our history. There are serious political scientists, philosophers that say when modernity came, we had the biggest shift in the way we see ourselves, the way we see truth, the way we see our relationship with the divine, the way we see our relationship with politics, democracy, good governance, all of these things, the notion of a revolution, the idea that you can have a revolution, all of these are modern ideas. Together, they cohered into something called modernity. The idea was that revelation is important, but reason is at least as important as revelation in finding your way through the world. You're entitled to your religion, but your religion is not the best in the world. Others have religion and have equal right to their private religious domain. We take these for granted, but that was not the way 1,000 years ago. When Christians came to the Muslim world, they thought Muslims were barbarians. When Christians came to the Americas, they thought the American natives were less than human. There is a boulevard in Los Angeles called after a theologian who argued that Native Americans are half humans. We shouldn't kill them like animals, but they're also not full humans. His name is Sepulveda. Yes, Sepulveda. When the question came, when they supposedly discovered America, America that had the Aztecs, America that had Native Americans, they discovered America. They said, these are heathen. What do you do with them? They're animals. Somebody said, no, they're the natural slaves. But then modernity comes and says, no, difference doesn't mean superiority. Difference means difference. We must accept this notion. We must accept plurality. We must accept reason. We must accept reason at least on par with revelation. That paradigm is now under a challenge. Radical religion. Religion in general is on rise in ways that I think no one predicted in the first part of the 20th century. You look at the political theorists in the end of 19th century, they thought the age of religion has ended. Marx said religion is the opiate of the masses and the age of reason is upon us. He is shaking in his grave because everywhere you look, from the America, with the exception of many countries in Europe, anywhere else you look, religion is on the rise. And the most pernicious form of religion is religious fundamentalism. And that is on the rise. And it is trying to help sort of challenge this modern experience. Many of the countries that we are visiting are countries that are grappling with this problem. How to solve this problem, how to transcend this tension that exists on the horizon. In my view, globalism is, in economic sense, a new phenomenon. We've had globalism in the past. And I'm going to ask a few questions, 14 of them. It happened to be 14, and this will be my 14th trip. And 14 is a very religiously important number in Shiism. There are 14 saints, so there are 14 trips, and I, by accident, came up with 14 questions. I'm going to ask you these questions, and I think by the end you'll get the flavor of what I'll be talking about, which complements what Judy will be talking about. Have you thought about whether there is a difference between Silicon Valley, where we begin our trip, and Samarkand, one of the most remarkable cities we will visit, a place where some of the biggest mosques in the world are? Is there a relationship, aside from the fact that they both start with an S, between Samarkand and Silicon Valley? I would say without Samarkand, Silicon Valley would have been impossible to imagine. And I'll make the argument in the trip, not today. I'll convince you that without Samarkand, Silicon Valley would have been impossible. Is there a relationship between Paris, a city we will see, and Esfahan, a city, incidentally, you will see, and although it's in my country, I won't see. I'm going to get off the plane before you enter Iran and get back on it after you leave Iran. I'm a persona non grata inside Iran. They think that we have sort of started the democratic movement in Iran. Mike McFaul, Larry Diamond, and I, they think we have started this, and they especially think that I am the CIA's bagman for Iran. So for that reason, I'm going to get off and then get on. But is there a relationship between Paris and Isfahan? There's a profound different relationship. One of the most important books about the modern experience is written about an Irani citizen from the city of Isfahan who goes to Paris, and Montesquieu, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, writes a book about how can you be modern and Persian. And this is about an Isfahani in the city of Paris. Is there a relationship between Isfahan and Jerusalem? There's a profound relationship. Jerusalem, when was destroyed, Jews escaped. Jews went to Babylonian captivity. A Persian king released them from Babylonian captivity. And one of the places where the Jews landed in Iran was Isfahan, because they said the weather reminds them of Jerusalem. Is there a relationship between Isfahan and Shakespeare? They said I love Shakespeare. There is a profound relationship between Isfahan and Shakespeare. If you look at Shakespeare, one of the countries Shakespeare loves, other than his own and other than a few European countries, he doesn't like Muslims. He doesn't like the Turks. We're not going to go to Turkey, but he is afraid of the Turks. The only reason they bring Othello on, although he's black, is because they think a Muslim can fight the Turks. Otherwise, the Turks are going to win Europe. In that context, he has nothing but praise for Iran. Why? The relationship is between an Isfahan and two British guys who come to Isfahan, fall in love with the city, and go back and report their findings. And they convince Shakespeare. Is there, we can go on. Is there a relationship between Isfahan and Paris? Is there, where is the first boulevard created? Where does the idea of a boulevard? Streets, large streets lined with trees, end in big squares. Where does that come from? Where do Europeans learn it? Where does the original design for Versailles comes from? It ain't in Versailles. It ain't in Europe. It's in Isfahan. Where does the idea of paradise, Isfahan is very much like paradise. Where does the idea of paradise and hell, the idea of angels, the idea of life after death, the idea of a Messiah, the idea of a millennium as an important 1,000-year cycle of history, the idea of the Satan come from? Have you ever thought about this? It certainly doesn't come from Christianity, I'm sorry to say. It doesn't come from Judaism. The first versions of these come from a religion that is created in the region we're going to go in. It's the Zoroastrianism, it is Mithraism, it is Manichaeism. These are ideas that spread very much in the global context of its time. You've all heard, probably, if you have any interest in religion, history of Christianity, you have heard the name of Saint Augustine, the founder of the Catholic Church. How many of you have read his Confessions? If you remember his Confessions, where is he? He's in North Africa. We're going to travel near where he is. In North Africa, he becomes a Manichaean. He becomes a Zoroastrian. He leaves Christianity because he says, these people seem to have figured it out better than Christianity has. Then he has a moment, he is reborn and becomes a Christian again. So you have Zoroastrian ideas go all the way to North Africa, all the way to Japan, all the way to parts of China. And you have Buddhist ideas that have come all the way to every part that we are going to visit. Do you know what this is? I carry this all the time. What is this? It's a worry bead. It's a worry bead. Muslims have it with 99 beads. This incidentally comes from a very special part of Iran. It is a very special kind of stone. It becomes more translucent the more you play with it. It used to be completely green. You all have it. You have it in Christianity. You have it in Buddhism. This comes from Buddhism, goes to Islam, changes a little bit. What is the difference between this and a Buddhist or a Catholic worry bead? Anybody know?
A cross.
No, you sometimes you play with the little cross. It's the number of beads. This has 99 beads. Why 99? God has 99 names. And this goes from becoming 33 and some as 120 in this way. And if you follow, as we have a wonderful book that follows, this construction of this, you have globalism in 8th century. But you also have globalism of ideas, an interchange of ideas, a borrowing of ideas. The reason all of these are very, very important, and I'll try to give you a couple of more examples of how these things converge, is because part of the narrative that you're hearing from the radical Islamists is that there are these gaps between Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and that because of these gaps, we now need to go back to a pure Islam. My argument is that these gaps are fictitious. There is a lot more inter-borrowing and inter-influence than you can ever imagine. How many of you have read Rumi? Rumi is probably the best-selling poet in America. In a fairly mediocre translation even, he's a best-selling poet. Rumi lived in a part of the world that is now Afghanistan. He was born there. Lived much of his time in the part of the world that we now call Iran. Died in what we call Turkey. Where does the name Rumi come from? What does it remind you of? Rumi.
Sufi.
He's a Sufi, but Rumi doesn't remind you of Sufi. Rumi reminds you of a town, a place. Rome. Why is it called Rumi? Because at that time, the Byzantines were in Turkey, and the Muslims called all of this area Rome. ISIS has a magazine called Rumi. What does ISIS have to do with Rumi? ISIS believes that when Rome is defeated in Istanbul, Islam will become a global empire. If you read Rumi, and if you read St. Francis, and if you read Kabbalah, there's virtually no difference between them. I am willing to bet on the trip I will read to you stories without telling you who they are, and you won't be able to tell me whether this is Jewish mysticism, Islamic mysticism, or Christian mysticism. There is a remarkable confluence of ideas when you come to this notion. That's where there is a meeting of culture. And many of the places, you go to Indonesia. Why is Indonesian Islam very different than the Indonesian the Islam you get in parts of the Middle East? Indonesian Islam was created by the Sufis. They were the first promoters of Islam. They created a different version of Islam. So everywhere we're going to go, we're going to see, I think, and I'm going to try to make the argument, we're going to see how globalism of ideas happened, how ideas traveled, whether Jewish, Zoroastrian, Christian, Gnostic, Egyptian. They traveled, and as they traveled, they took local colors. And when they took local colors, eventually they lend themselves to this kind of a particularism. The kind of particularism that is now mixing with what Judy was talking about. Right now, I think the most fervent form of nationalism is religious nationalism. People who are defining themselves not as nations, but as members of this religious community. And the way you can, I think, explain it is understanding it historically. The way you can understand it and navigate your way, I think, out of it, and hopefully everyone else, is to understand how interconnected all of these ideas, how this kind of a purity that they claim to have, and other religions also sometimes in their more radical forms claim to have the same kind of excess, same kind of extremism. So in a sense, the debate is about, to go back, is about modernity. Is modernity something Western? Is the East, again, is the East fundamentally different than West? I'm sure you've heard this in comments on television. We don't understand the Middle East because they are different than us. The East is different than us. They do things differently. You might have read Rudyard Kipling. The East is the East, the West is the West, and the twain shall never meet. They do these things differently. In terms of capitalist development, they do it very differently. In terms of everyday life, they do it differently. One of the most influential books in sociology, written by one of the most influential sociologists of religion, Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It says, what you need for the world is something like a Protestant ethic. Work hard, save, and God values the rich, and be happy. Weber says, the West is better at capitalism because the West is disworldly. The West looks at the world in a logical way. The West creates philosophy. The West creates symmetry. The East creates religion. He says, why is it that all the major religions in the world have been created in the East? The West has created philosophy. The West has created Aristotle and Plato, has created science. What has the East contributed? All the major religions of the world. In the West, we say, show me the money. In the East, they say, show me the miracle. I'm quoting Max Weber. Is this a true way of understanding the world? I don't think it is. If you go to Samarkand, if you go to Esfahan, you will see that if you wanted to be the best scientist in the world, the best physicist in the world in 13th century, the place you would go was called Maraghe. Maraghe is now half derelict town. At that time, they had some of the best centers for astronomy in the world. You had some of the best chemists. That's where algebra was discovered. That's why you couldn't imagine modern science without algebra. That's where Aristotle was reintroduced to the world. The notion that the East does only religion and the West does science doesn't fit the historical narrative. And we're going to see many of the places that were the height of science 800 years ago, 700 years ago. But then something happened in the West. Renaissance happened in the West. And the West took off. Every year, every century, the West had the bigger share of the wealth, with the exception of oil in the last 50 years. If oil hadn't come, you would now have virtually every poorest country in the world, not every, the disproportionate number of them in the Islamic world. So the question, once this happened to the West, two responses began to emerge. Some in the West, some in the East, like the Shah of Iran, like Ataturk, like Soviet Marxism, Mao in China, decided to essentially recreate that model, whether in an authoritarian form, in a different form, to catch up with the West. The West was now a model, and they were trying to catch up with it. By late 19th century, early 20th century, some people began to say no. Some people in the Muslim world began to say no. We don't want to go down that way. We want to go back to our roots. We want to go back. We don't want nationalism. Nationalism is a Western colonial gimmick. We want to go back to our spiritual community. We want to redefine the region. The Middle East, as we understand it, is going to be redefined because the borders that were drawn were borders that make no sense and were drawn as a result of colonial games. The Sykes-Picot, which is so despised in the Middle East, is a sign of the arrogance of power. Syria doesn't make sense if it's not concocted as designed by the colonies. Iraq doesn't make sense. Jordan doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to divide the Kurds in 4 different sections of the world. That is being renegotiated. And part of the reason the religious forces are very successful in fostering the need for renegotiation is the disgruntlement, the inequality for globalization. That feeds the fury, but they don't want a better share of globalization. They don't want a better share of the economics of capitalism. They want to redefine the world. And they're redefining the world at a moment where the world is in a crisis, as Judy explains, where the world is in a different place than it ever was. Jews, Christians, and Muslims and Buddhists have lived together for 1,300 years. There has never been in 1,300 years a moment where there were more Muslims in the Christian world than there were Jews and Christians in the Muslim world. Till 1940s, certainly till 1900s, there were several 100% more Jews and Christians in the Islamic world than there were Muslims in the West. Muslims just didn't come to the West. This was the land of the apostates. This was unclean. They would come only under duress. Now you have 45 million Muslims in Europe, 6 million in the US. You might have a lot less after November 8th, but it is 6 million. And it, by all accounts, is going to increase. So you have a complete reconfiguration of the world, and in a moment of crisis, and in a moment of crisis where, again, I think the world needs the wisest, the most prudent leadership, and it isn't forthcoming, that these countries are trying to renegotiate their way to modernity. And if we find these connections, if we find how these ideas traveled and influenced one another, we can retrace and decide how counter ideas might well travel. You can't fight this, in my view, with the military. You can't just fight it with the economic power of Silicon Valley. Those are going to be very important. It's going to be an intellectual struggle. And to me, the foray into the opening salvo in this intellectual struggle is to show that we have a lot more in common than we have in conflict. That even our religions owe a great deal to one another. You read the Quran, 3/4 of the Quran are stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The idea that this is something completely different simply doesn't match the reality. If we can get this across, Then the notion that all Muslims and all Christians and all Jews are enemies and apostates, or anyone who is not like us is an enemy and apostate and should be killed. If you're a Zoroastrian, you can be killed. If you're a Izadi, you can be killed. That is the way I think, convincing them that that is a marginal reading of a reality that is much more common between us. That, to me, is the way we can rediscover this world and see how the places less traveled are not necessarily the places that have less in common. Thank you very much.